Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Steve Bax. I am the Adult Services Manager here at the Monroe County Public Library, and we are pleased tonight to partner with the IU Center for the Study of Global Change and the IU Institute for East European and Russian Studies. Or did I get that backwards?
It is Russian and East European Studies Institute.
Right. This partnership between the center and the libraries has gone back probably 5 or 6 years now, and we've had topics ranging from Middle East to, of course, Russia to domestic politics as well. And I'd like to take just a few moments to introduce Susan Garcia from the center, and she will introduce our panelists. Thank you.
I'm Susan Garcia. I'm Outreach Coordinator at the IU Center for the Study of Global Change, which is a national resource center on campus. I'm glad to see you here tonight. The weather out there looked kind of ominous, so I'm glad we have at least an intimate group. Thank you for being here. We have three wonderful presenters with us tonight, each with a very unique perspective on this topic. So the person that we're going to hear from first is Diana Sokolova. She is a Russian native and a PhD student of journalism here at IU. And after we hear from her, we're going to hear from Dr. Ben Eklof, who's a history professor at IU with expertise in modern Russia. He's also lived in Russia. And finally, last, we're going to hear from Rosemary Pennington, who is an award-winning journalist and a PhD candidate in journalism here at IU. So would you please help me welcome them? They're going to each present, and then at the end, we'll have time for questions and answers, and hopefully maybe even some discussion. So I'll guide us through that when the time comes. And for now, we're going to hear from Diana.
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming here and being here on this rainy day. So each of us are going to cover different parts that are related to this subject, and I'm presenting the insider's perspective. And I will talk a little bit about the Russians' history, about the transition from Soviet Union, and about my perspective, how it felt what it felt like growing up in Russia and what challenges my family and my friends had to face. So, as we all know, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and just to explain or just to give you an idea of how life or felt like or was like in the end of the Soviet Union, you can take a look at this picture and the next one. The stores were empty. It wasn't very easy to buy food. All of the families were designated a certain amount of, let's call them coupons. And for example, the amount of coupons for flour, sugar, and other products depended on how many members in the family you had. So if you, let's say, had a family of 4, then of course you'd get more coupons, but not more than the government decided for you. And I remember when I was a child, I would get those coupons from the manager of our house, and one day I came to get the coupons, and she said, well, the government doesn't do this anymore. There are no more coupons. And I, as a child, I was 5 or 6 years old, and I was very surprised, and I didn't understand how my family would get food if there were no coupons. The stores were empty, and you had to, if you wanted to buy some alcohol for champagne or wine for the New Year or Christmas celebrations, you had to get up very, very early and stand in the line for the whole day, and the line would be looking something like that. So when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1999, Boris Yeltsin came to power. And I just want us to imagine how young the Russian society is. If you think about it, it's a very young society with a very rich history. Russia itself is only 23 years old, and it only had 3 leaders. It's Boris Yeltsin, who was the president from 91 to 99, Vladimir Putin, who was the president from 2000 to 2008, then Dmitry Medvedev, who was the president from 2008 to 2012, and currently Vladimir Putin is the president. When the Soviet Union collapsed, I can tell that Russians were very excited to meet the Western world. This is a picture of first McDonald's being opened in Moscow in 1991, and you can see this long, enormously long line in front of its doors. And I know that this line started to form when McDonald's was at night, at midnight. Russian people were very enthusiastic about new changes. They were eager to travel, to see the world, to welcome foreigners. They were very happy about the fall of the Iron Curtain. That was the time when Yeltsin was the president. And unfortunately, Mr. Yeltsin's time in the office has been quite a traumatic experience for Russia. And since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia had to transform itself from a state-run economy into a free market one. And not even one country can do it in 1 year, 4 years. It's a very, very hard task. Yeltsin tried to impose economic reforms, and they helped some, but we've seen that the living standards of people, of Russians, has worsened, and has worsened dramatically. After this economic reforms, and also after the fact that when Russia was just raising, the United States and the World Bank imposed the shock therapy for Russia. And just like as Ben and I were joking about it, it was mostly shock than a therapy. In 1998, the ruble lost 70% of its value against dollar, and 29% of the population, and it's 42 million people, were living below the poverty line, and my family was one of them. In that 1998, when the ruble lost 70%, a lot of workers whose salaries were paid from the budget, from the government, were not paid their salaries and pensions for several months in a row, 2 or 3. My mom is a retired teacher, and I grew up in a single-parent family. And I remember how tough it was when she wasn't getting paid. One day, we didn't have anything to eat for dinner, and we only had dark bread, and she put some salt and some oil on it, and she was crying, but I couldn't understand why. For me, it was fun. But that was the life of 42 million Russians, and it was very, very hard. The factories were abandoned. A lot of factories were purchased by oligarchs or by people who had some money at the same time, and this privatization of factories helped them to become oligarch. And an oligarch is a term for a very, very rich person. The villages or small towns disappeared. A lot of people moved to bigger cities like St. Petersburg or Moscow or capitals of regions in hope to make more money. This was life, but the United States President Bill Clinton praised Boris Yeltsin for bringing democracy to Russia. The UK Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair, said the world was more stable and secure as a result of the former president's leadership. But were the Russians happy? No, they were not. This destabilization, poverty, ugliness around them, it really made citizens unhappy and miserable. So Yeltsin resigned on the New Year's Eve of 1999, and that was quite shocking for us. The New Year's in Russia is more important than Christmas, and as usual, my family was around the table celebrating New Year's Eve. We were having lots of food, and we were waiting for the presidential speech. Every year, no matter what, a president of Russia delivers a New Year's speech, basically summing up the events that happened in the previous year and what we hope for as a Russian society in the following year. Nobody from my family or regular citizens could foresee Yeltsin resignation. And I remember I was shocked and lost again when we were just thinking, who's going to be the president? Just 2 months or 3 months before that, Putin came to political power, and he was appointed for Russian citizens out of nowhere to be a prime minister. He was unfamiliar to Russian citizens who were not very tightly familiar with the political system. And he became the prime minister. He had to wait 4 months before the election, and he really took advantage of that time. Instead of just promising Russian people goods and bright future like Yeltsin did, he increased salaries of those people who get their money from the budget and pensions. You can see that the GDP per capita, GDP grew tremendously from the 1999, 98. That's when Putin came to power, and you can compare the stability, the stable growth compared to the previous instability. So life got better. And it didn't get better on promises. It really got better. People started to afford traveling. People started to afford education, dressing better. My mom was able to send me to Italy when I was 13, and it was huge. I don't think I would ever be able to go there during Yeltsin or in the Soviet times. However, people were still nostalgic, especially the older generation. People were still nostalgic about the Soviet past because they felt like life was better back then. When Putin announced that he wanted to run for the president for the third term, it caused a lot of controversial tensions in the international community, and a lot of people were arguing whether or not it was constitutional. He won with the majority of votes, over 63%, and Russians wanted him. A lot of, here in the West, the politicians were mostly arguing about whether or not it was constitutional, but nobody really mentioned how stable the life was for Russians, how afraid and terrified they were of those times when they were not paid their salaries, and how they didn't want to get back to that. Nobody really cared about democracy. Nobody really cared about if Putin is limiting some of their rights, because all they cared is about feeding their families. They were working hard, they were bringing the money, and it was happening. So Russians wanted Putin for a third term, and my family, my mom was saying that we needed a strong leader. Russia was still very weak, and we needed a strong leader. And I just want to note that historically, Russia, Soviet Union, and Federal Russia before that, they always had strong leaders. They either had Tsars, then they had Bolsheviks, and then they have democratically elected presidents, but we really, really want them to be strong and decisive for us. This is just in our genes. This screenshot was taken from the presidential election night, and I, as a Russian, can say that, frankly, for the third term, Putin didn't have any alternatives. There was just not a strong enough candidate who could compete with Putin and who could deliver the stability, even on the words and promises that Putin did. There was one candidate, and I think that he will return to the politics next presidential run for the elections. Mikhail Prokhorov, he's a businessman and an oligarch, and he was trying to hide this note from his biography because Russians don't really like oligarchs, very rich people. But the rest of these figures are very, very familiar political figures. And from my Russian perspective, I can say that Vladimir Zhirinovsky is known for his extravagant behavior. By extravagant, I mean cursing in public, yelling, not being very... He's from the Liberal Democratic Party, but he doesn't really seem to, at least my generation, is altogether man. Zyuganov Gennady is from a leader of Communist Party, and he actually is the biggest rival of Putin right now because of that Soviet nostalgia that the older generation has. Putin won, and I think that maybe you've seen that picture that was picked up by the Western media and just spread all over the world, Putin crying. And his press secretary released an issue the following day saying that Putin was not crying, that was not tears, it was windy. The Russian president does not cry. We are strong, tough people. So a part of this discussion is focused on Crimea, and I will just touch upon from my personal perspective. So let's look at the map. Okay, so this is Russia, and this is Ukraine. And it used to be part of Soviet Union. And you can see how long the border is and the relativity of Ukraine to other countries. So Russia, I think, in my perspective, as an international relations scholar, political science scholar, journalism scholar, I think that Russia united with Crimea last month is a result of Russian-American relationships for the past 20 years. It was Russia exercising that power that is now emerging and coming back to Putin. It was Putin has been sending a signal to the West. Who is getting stronger. And it starts from afar. The reasons why Putin decided to get united with Crimea starts from afar. When when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was clear that Russia lost the Cold War. And I think just in real life, there is a loser and there is a winner, and the United States was a winner, Soviet Union was a loser, and the winner always has certain expectations. It had expectations that the loser will behave submissively on the international arena, will soon become more westernized and accept the Western mentality, Western way of thinking, and will develop slowly, not reaching previous success. And these expectations failed. Russia turned out to be not susceptible to Western ideas, mentality for several reasons. Well, first of all, Russia still remains, as I mentioned, a hostage in this Soviet past. And Russian roots lay in Eastern Byzantine Christianity. The Western roots, the American roots, date back to Rome and Christianity of the West, and that creates very, very different perspectives, mentalities, and values. And the gap between this, I think, unreachable. Russia also started to develop economically faster than it was expected from the world, especially after the applied shock therapy. The high prices for oil helped that, and it was one of the factors of fast development. Russia didn't behave submissively on the international arena, and the signs of it were clearly stated by the Russian government on the conflict around Yugoslavia and Kosovo, and NATO's intervention and permission to bomb it. And I just want to remind everyone that neither the Security Council of the United Nations nor the European Union gave permission to bomb Kosovo. And the United States did it on their own, and as a result, Kosovo got divided from Serbia by force, but it was still recognized by the European Union, and those actions were accepted as legitimate. So I think that was the start of complicated relationships between Russia and the United States. And during that time, the United States tried to establish its influence in different key regions of the world, and Russia was very, very nervous. But Russia could not afford losing Ukraine to NATO or to the United States. And not only because of geopolitical factors, which are very, very important, in especially particular this fight over Crimea, but also because we look at the role of NATO. So Ukraine is, I'm sorry, I'll go a little back. So the blue countries on this map, the NATO members countries, and the green one, those who are trying to get to NATO. And Ukraine is one of them, but Russia just doesn't want to lose Ukraine. And it's not only because of geopolitical issues, but also because we really are Slavic brothers. Russians feel this connection with at least the eastern Ukraine. And this picture, Ben and I were trying to decide on when this poster was created, and we think it was 17th or 18th century.
Not the poster, the representation on the trying to represent the 17th century. Yeah.
The representation. So that was my last point. So we really feel connected. And Crimea historically has been a part of Russia. When Khrushchev signed it off to Ukraine, he allegedly was drunk. And the votes were, it wasn't legitimate because when he brought to the parliament this decision, only 13 people voted for that. 13 of 27. The rest did not show up because if you vote against it, you're dead. So we really feel strong connection as Russians to Ukraine, and especially the older generation. Some of younger generations do believe in pro-Maidan and support the younger party. But the truth is that I believe they're disconnected a little bit from history. So they're less fearless than my mom is, who believes that Maidan is led by part of the Nazis party. Media coverage is different. Media coverage of Ukraine is different in both Russia and United States, and I think it reflects our diplomatic relationships. And it's a tag war of power. We want the United States, or American media probably wants to be pro-government and supporting Obama's administration and sort of framing that issue through how dare Putin can take Crimea. This is not legal, but not taking into consideration issues that happen with the United States and Kosovo. So I think it's a little hypocritical, and I think Russians, the majority of Russians think that way. Rosemary will cover more about media coverage of this issue. That was my part. Thank you.
Did you get my slides done?
I'll get it now.
Well, she's setting up my slides for me because I'm an incompetent in that area. I just wanted to give you some basic background on Ukraine so that you can kind of make your own decisions when you read the press about what's going on there. It's one of the more complicated regions on Earth in terms of the notion of statehood and its boundaries. And in fact, it's been a traveling nation in that its boundaries have wandered around for several centuries. And you can see there where it's located today, that all looks very, very neat. You have Russia on the one hand, and you have Romania and Poland and et cetera, et cetera. But in reality, there was no such thing as Ukraine until, on the map, until the 20th century. Up until then, it was part of several different empires. Believe it or not, there was a Polish-Lithuanian Empire in early modern times that was the largest state in Europe. And Ukraine was really part of that. After that, it was, since the 17th century, it was incorporated into the Russian Empire primarily, but it was never called Ukraine. And most of the population who lived there did not know they were Ukrainians as such. Russians called them, they called the area either Little Russia or New Russia during the imperial period. And as I said, you wouldn't ever see it on the map itself as it existed. There were a few individuals, primarily intellectuals in the cities, who began to be conscious of themselves as Ukrainians in the middle of the 19th century as nationalism spread. But it was really, even in the early 20th century, among the majority of the population, it was not a strong notion that differentiated themselves from the Russians. After the Russian Revolution in 1917, where communism came into power, a federal system was set up in which each of the nationalities that had been part of the Russian Empire were given their own republic. It was all kind of a fig leaf for central rule. But nevertheless, these administrative structures were created, and Ukraine was one of the 15 republics that it was the second largest in terms of population and most important. So in 1954, however, when Khrushchev did give Crimea, for example, and I'll come back to Crimea, he gave it to Ukraine. It was not seen as a significant act because this, unlike American states, the Soviet republics had no real power. And it was never in anyone's mind that they could separate out into different countries, for example. The Crimea was never Ukrainian, and I'll come back to that again later, nor was it Russian in many ways until the 18th century, certainly. But I just wanted to mention also the capital of Ukraine, Kiev, in the 19th century. You would very seldom find a Russian there. It was really primarily, you would never find a Ukrainian there. You would see primarily Polish, Jewish, and Russian-speaking as the majority of the population. So it's an invented nation with, let me see if we can go through a couple of these, the earlier.
You could use the and just.
Yeah, but I can't see without my glasses on here, then I can't read my, just a second. So that's another representation. Well, these are the overlapping cultures, actually, if you can see down there, that influenced the territories that came to be Ukraine. I'm looking for the one that I had where, let's see. I have to go over there and read. Yeah. Well, this also gives you, let me see. I'm going to have to do a better job of this next time around here. Oh, this is the historical regions. You can see the green, Galicia, was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Volhynia was primarily part of what had been controlled by Poland. And then coming in from the other side, there was Russian influence. From the on the bottom, you see the Ottoman Empire, Turkish Muslim, all of which exerted some sort of control and influence over the culture as well as the societies. And each of these empires had their own institutions, not only different cultures and languages, but they had institutions that on the local, and these remained even after they sometimes shifted the boundaries of Ukraine. So Ukraine was also a crossroads of civilizations, is a way to see it, and cultures. First, originally it was a site in early Russian history, and even if contemporary Russia is 15 or 25 years old, Russia itself existed as a geographic entity for almost 1,000 years, but within this context, it was the boundary between nomadic and sedentary civilizations. In other words, you had settled civilizations, but you had nomads coming in from the east, bringing in largely Turkic cultures as well. And in terms of religions, it was a meeting place of Eastern Orthodoxy, or what we would think of as Greek Orthodoxy, and Catholicism as well as Judaism, with a very large Jewish population brought in here. There was also another independent church coming out of Ukraine called the Unia Church, which recognized the supremacy of the Pope, but practiced the rituals and the rites of the Greek or Eastern Orthodox Church. Never officially recognized by Russians, of course. So in Odessa it's a city that hasn't been in the news very much, but it's one of the largest cities in Ukraine. It was essentially built by Catherine the Great and with a very Western models. But it is one of the most diverse cities in the world. Like many of the kind of Middle Eastern cities where you see Sarajevo in Eastern Europe and Salonika in Greece, where you had an incredible mix of populations and religions living together more or less peacefully into the 20th century, until ethnic cleansing began to really change this. Odessa still remains a city very important for American Jews, because many Jews and musicians and writers from the city of Odessa on the Black Sea emigrated to the United States. Okay, so it was a crossroads of civilization. It was an invented nation. It was also Europe's breadbasket in many ways, and smokestack. And for when actually Russia had its revolution in 1917, it was in the middle of World War I, and then the communists were faced with Germany marching across its frontiers, and they had to sign a peace with Germany to get out of this war. They had to give up Ukraine. And Leon Trotsky, one of the great revolutionaries of this period, he objected to this, and he said, without Ukraine, Russia is a fifth-rate power which belongs in the 16th century. So it was because of this was the most fertile lands, and it also was the major source of coal mines and iron ore for the industrialization of Russia. And the picture was that Russia simply couldn't be a great power in the world without it. Hitler, of course, had his designs on Ukraine primarily for those regions as well, for the natural resources and for the agriculture, which he desperately needed. Today, Ukraine, economically, is crippled by corruption and the same deindustrialization processes that took place and you described after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The third other way in which I would describe Ukraine is that is a much less, we think of a very rich action of cultures, et cetera, with this rich history and these moving boundaries. But it also was the site of the killing fields of the 20th century. And this one author named Tim Snyder has written a book called Bloodlands. There's an audio copy of it in this library that's gotten a lot of attention, where he talks about Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, where somewhere between 1/4 and 1/10 of the entire population was wiped out in World War II. But this was the end rather than the beginning of the killing, because the killing really began at the end of the 19th century with pogroms against Jews, and then in World War I, where this was the Eastern Front, where massive slaughter took place. And then in the 1930s, when Stalin imposed collectivization upon his population and created a man-made famine in Ukraine, which took 5 million lives. And the Ukrainians call it their own Holocaust for this reason. So it's had that very, very unhappy history. And people in the Soviet Union, in Russia today, but especially in Ukraine, know what war means, and they don't want to they do not want to have anything to do with that. It's not something that to think about lightly. I like to tell my students, for example, we lost 300,000 people in World War II. That was really hard on us. It was a very painful experience. But the Soviet Union lost 27 million, and this was the area where the most concentrated violence took place, and it's left a permanent scar. What about post-Soviet Ukraine? Well, it's very easy to understand that the Ukrainian inherited the post-Soviet curse. They inherited a kleptocracy. They inherited a ruling class that had been fervid communists that suddenly became Ukrainian nationalists in order to make the adjustment to this new world and to continue to rule. They've experienced the same kind of deindustrialization that took place in, let's see. Oh, you know what's going on is I actually have the wrong PowerPoint on. This was before I edited it out, so forgive me. Let's see if I can go back to the early. I wanted to say, first of all, that as you may know, Ukraine is divided. Yeah, there we go. Ukraine, if you can see the blue in the middle, that's the Dnieper River. And Ukraine is divided into east and west. But it's called right bank and left bank. And if you look at the map, you'd think right bank is over there, right, which is the east. But it's not, because the rivers in Eastern Europe flow south. And so people who were going down the rivers said, oh, the right bank's over here. So the right bank is actually West Ukraine, and it is the very Polish-influenced part of the country. The left bank is the East Bank, which is primarily the Russian, but also Russian-Ukrainian population. And well, what I wanted to say here is that this is what you hear in the news, but it's actually a lot more muddled than that. All Russians understand Ukrainian, speak freely in Ukrainian. They can speak Russian, and Ukrainians speak back to them in Ukrainian, and there's no problem understanding one another. There's even a language that's kind of a colloquial language called, Surzhyk, right, which mixes the two languages, kind of like Brighton Beach Russian in a certain sense in the United States. But it's not, and there's a high level of intermarriage between these people. So I'm supporting in a lot of ways what you say there, that it's not like there are Ukrainians. In the Western areas, yes, there's some fervid nationalists who don't like Russians, but I don't think that's in general the situation at all. And I think the younger generation, and I think there are public opinion studies that suggest that, what they really prefer is open borders with Russia and access to the EU where they could find work. They really want both of these. They do not want the kind of divisions that are being imposed upon them in this conflict and being hardened by it. And this is partly the result, as you pointed out, of a conflict between the United States. I think I've run out of time for one thing, but I would also agree that this problem began back in 1990 with the collapse of the Soviet Union and with a very specific agreement that was made to the rulers of the Soviet Union, to Gorbachev, a promise by James Baker that NATO would not be expanded into this area. Germany had come Germany had been reunited. The Soviet Union was pulling 400,000 troops out to the east, and we said to them, not 1 inch eastward would we move NATO, because the Soviet Union could not see Western NATO forces moving into these territories. We violated that. We moved into not only throughout to Eastern Europe, and we created. I'm no fan of Putin actually at all, but we created this type of antagonism and feeling that they got ripped off in this situation. Finally, I just want to say a footnote on the Crimea, and I'm so sorry I don't have the right thing with me and I don't have time to put it up. Crimea is one of the most beautiful little areas on Earth. It's a subtropical area, and it was part of the Ottoman Empire. It was actually populated by Muslim Tartars, not Ukrainians or Russians, until the 18th century when it was conquered and incorporated into the Russian Empire. In the 19th century, it became a resort area, much like where I grew up on Cape Cod. It was a watering hole for the wealthy. It was beaches. The royal families went there. The Russian middle class and aristocracy spent their time, because, again, it's extraordinarily beautiful and subtropical. And, but at the same time, it was in the 20th century, in the 19th century, it was a site of two heroic sieges, the sieges of Sebastopol, this big military base in the 19th century during the Crimean War, where it held out for 1.5 years against Western invaders, and in World War II, where the same naval base held out against the invading German army for over 1 year as well. So Russians have very specific images of, it's not only a fun place to go that they don't want to give up because it's got beaches, but also it is a site of kind of heroic memories of struggle for the country. So anyway, I hope this provides you a little bit of kind of knowledge about these basic kind of things you need to understand about this very rich and interesting and troubled area right now. Thank you. I don't know how much time I took. I ran out. Did I go over 15?
I have no idea.
I'll tell you in a second. Okay.
Deanna, yeah.
No, I didn't. Okay. When you have a lot to say, you just start speaking faster and faster. That's the way you get over it. Okay.
So I am not a scholar of this region at all. I'm the wrong Pennington. My youngest brother is actually a Slavic linguist, and Russia is his specialization. So I feel like I wish my brother was here with me. But I am a media scholar, and I think that Ben and Deanna have explained really well sort of the complicated nature of Russia and of Ukraine and of the situation. And I think I'm here to talk about the noise, right? Like the fact that that's not been communicated in the media, right? What we get is a very simplistic, I would say kind of Cold War-esque narrative of what's happening. And so quickly I'm going to run through some of the framing that's been taking place, and then sort of a how do you sift through news stories to find worthwhile media. So these are just some headlines from today about Russia. So first is NASA suspending some ties with Russia because apparently Russia is a threat to the space race. We have the story that broke this morning about the NATO commander saying if Russia wanted to take over Ukraine, they could do it in 3 to 5 days. Here's a story from The Atlantic about Russia planning to partition Ukraine, I would assume along that river border. This one was a story that just came out this afternoon. Russia is now recalling the ambassador to NATO because of all of this stuff. And let's not forget that not only is Russia a threat to space and to geopolitics, Russia's also a threat to Miley Cyrus. Because whatever's happening, she may not be able to go and perform because of the conflict or the potential conflict, right? And so those stories and those headlines, and if you Google Russia and if you look in Twitter Russia, you're going to find very similar things, right? And those are all frames that, in a way, are mimicking these kind of historic media frames of what Russia is and what's taking place, right? And there are 4 that I've sort of been kind of looking at a little more closely, and I'm sure there are more, but continually Russia's framed as a threat. This political cartoon with the Soviet bear threatening not just the U.S. but everywhere, right? So Russia's continually been framed as a threat since post-World War II, and probably, I'm not a historian, probably a little farther back as well, right?
That bear image came out in the 18th century when it was a rivalry with Britain.
Oh, really?
So back.
I did not know that. I just knew it was the bear. That's what I remember from Russia growing up is vodka, bears, and fuzzy hats. That's what my memory of learning about Russia was as a kid.
Which period is this image?
This I'm not sure when that I found it via Google today, so, and I felt like it communicated that idea of Russia being a threat really well. We can find out after this is over if you'd like. Related to that is this idea of Russia as a bully, and that comes up a lot in sort of news stories about diplomatic talks. If you hear stories about the UN Security Council meetings, there's always this narrative of the United States and Western Europe want to go one way, but Russia and China, usually together, are going to bully them into going another way, right? And that's one example of that narrative that comes up. As corrupt, right? Whether that's true or not, that's a frame that's sort of been circulating for a very long time. And then as a joke, Yakov Smirnov and the In Soviet Russia jokes. I saw one this afternoon when I was looking this up, where he said, in Soviet Russia, in America, you find the party, but in Soviet Russia, the party finds you, right? So like this very famous sort of joking about Russia, and Russia being this sort of corrupt, backward place that we all make fun of, right? And that's related to a Cold War, I mean the modern framing, related to Cold War clash of civilizations rhetoric, right? Where it's East versus West. We are defining ourselves by what we're not, and what we're not is commie Soviet Russians who drink vodka and are in the Communist Party, right? And so it's sort of the framework within which these news stories that we're seeing now are, right? Because frames are not just things that come out of nowhere. They come out of our societies, out of our cultural past, out of our histories, right? They're informed by all of that, and we as reporters and as individuals consuming media are informed by those frames as well. And so these are just some tips for sort of sifting through a lot of this, right? Because the narrative is very simplistic if you read the news about Russia. If you look on Facebook, I have friends who are like, oh, the Ukrainians are fighting for freedom, and I have other friends who are saying the Russians are terrible, and it seems like there's this really sort of stratified conversation that's not really talking about the contextualizations or the nuances or the histories of what's happening, right? And again, that's a reflection of, I think, in a large part, what we have access to in the media. So some strategies for dealing with the noise, and there's a lot of it, right? So it's important to remember that everyone has a perspective. I have a perspective, you have a perspective, news media outlets have perspectives. That's not to say that you should definitely throw away reporting from Fox News if you find it of use. It's just an acknowledgement of where that person is situated and what they're bringing to the table. Some reporters are better at mitigating their own sort of personal perspectives than others, and that's a thing to keep in mind too as you're reading. If you become a savvy news consumer, you may find that continually there's a reporter that you don't like, and then don't read their work anymore. Judith Miller famously wrote some really terrible things in the lead up to the Iraq War, which were rah, rah, USA, we're going to save the Iraqis. And for months leading into that, like you could just sort of see that ratcheting up in the rhetoric. And so I stopped reading her stories because I was like, this is someone who clearly has an agenda and is pushing an agenda, even though she's being published in the New York Times, right? So everyone has a perspective. It's important when you're reading news stories or blog posts to think about who is being quoted in the pieces and to think about, is it more than one person? If it's a news story relying on one source, don't read it. We verify our facts generally, and if journalists aren't verifying their facts, you shouldn't trust them. But in the School of Journalism, that's what we teach our students is you never write a story with one source because you have to verify what the other person has said. Or if they're wrong, find out why they're wrong, right? So you don't rely on one source in a story, especially with international news. You want to find news outlets or bloggers, whoever you're reading, who are including perspectives from people on the ground and from this place. So NPR, in the first few days of this, of what was happening in Ukraine in the Euromaidan protest, they were relying a lot on eyewitness accounts from BBC reporters, which is great. The BBC is wonderful, but at the same time, you need to have people who are from that place sort of helping you contextualize what's happening. Relying on someone who is coming in from outside, who is, no matter how long they've been reporting, there's going to be a bit of a disconnect, right? Like I've been to Germany a lot, and I could report on Germany and say, this is what's happening, this is kind of why I got an idea of why this is happening, but until you get that native perspective, that perspective from someone who has lived there, who grew up in the culture, who understands those nuances, you're not going to get the full story, right? So you want to find news outlets or Huffington Post pieces that have information from people in that place. Read widely. I know there's an onslaught of media every day. I read a lot for my jobs, and I'm always like, this is too much. But if you read widely, it will help you, one, figure out who to trust and who not to trust, because you'll get an idea of what's good reporting and what's bad reporting. And also it will expose you to a lot of different perspectives, right? You're never going to get the full picture from one media outlet ever. I don't care if it's the New York Times, NPR, BBC, Deutsche Welle, you're never going to get the full perspective. So if you read widely across platforms and across media, it will help you get a better picture. Blogs are really great. Just be careful of the blogs you choose to consume. Personal blogs, even those can be really wonderful if you're reading blogs for people who seem to know what they're talking about, or there are a lot of blogs in connection with the Syria conflict, right, where there are actually Syrian activists who are blogging about what's happening, and it's one way information is getting out. And I read a lot of those for my jobs, and there are some of those for Russia and Ukraine too. So find those blogs that you feel like you can trust, but just know that not every blog is trustworthy. Use Wikipedia. I would never tell my students to ever base a report on Wikipedia, but I think if you ever come across something in a news story or a tweet or a blog post that you think is questionable, wiki it. Because even if the wiki entry is not great, most of them have really great footnotes because they have to source. Like, that's the whole point of Wikipedia, is it's a free, open-sourced, multi-sourced encyclopedia. So normally they're very well footnoted, and you can always follow those footnotes to find out where they find their information and follow the links. It takes a lot of time, but in the environment we live in, where we have so much media, it's important to take that time to really sift through what's there. And then two, when you're consuming media, I think it's always important to think about your own biases. Again, as journalists, clearly we all have our own biases that we bring into a situation. I am trained to say, when I walk into a situation, say, oh, this is what I think of that. Let me set that aside for now and try to deal with what I'm seeing and maybe later figure out why I had this reaction. I don't always do that as a news consumer. Sometimes I read something and I'm like, that is crap. And I don't think about why do I think it's crap. And so it's important to really think about what you're bringing to a news story and why you're judging it the way you're judging it. And then quickly, to round things out so we can open up a conversation, everyone should be on Twitter. If you are active in media, if you're online, you should be on Twitter, even if you don't ever actually tweet. Because there are a lot of really interesting people who are tweeting, and they're tweeting either links to analysis that they find interesting, they're retweeting things from people they may be following in Russia who you may not even know to follow, right? There are a lot of really interesting people on Twitter, and these are outlets that I follow, and I feel like I could recommend to you pretty comfortably. So Brookings and Pew, right, both think tank research centers doing a lot of really interesting work. Brookings posts a lot of really great analysis of different topics. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace does a really great job of posting analysis, and then they'll also link to other news outlets that they think you should read as well. So it's sort of a nice, here's what we think, and here's what other people are writing. The Media Consortium is a Twitter account that pulls together news from a variety of different independent media outlets. So a lot of corporate media are in Twitter. So the Media Consortium is a space where you can get access to maybe media outlets that you weren't familiar with. The Global Post and Global Voices Online, I think, are really useful. Global Post is more of a traditional media outlet with a more global perspective, and Global Voices Online is actually citizen journalism. So they have people in the places, in Ukraine, in Russia, writing from their own perspective about what's happening there. They're writing in English, so automatically there is a sort of perhaps worldview or perspective they're bringing, but at least it's a worldview that you can have access to. Foreign policy, I'm not a policy person, I'm not a political scientist, but they have a lot of really nice blogs where they'll have experts, grad students, or young academics who will break down situations for you in really sort of accessible language. And then the last two are journalism accounts that I think are really useful. Pulitzer Center does a lot of reporting from around the world on stories that are underreported. So they were one of the first outlets that did a lot on sort of childbirth issues in some rural African countries. And then they've done some stuff on Rwanda. They've done a lot of stuff in South America because South America has gotten overlooked in the last several, probably decades. So they've done a lot of work there. So they're great for international. And ProPublica does investigative reporting here in the States largely. And then here are some outlets that I read every day. The Guardian, it's a liberal British paper, and I threw the globalization section up because that's what I access almost every day. They're one of the few media outlets that actually devotes a space on their website to only globalization or global issues. They also have an international development section, which I think is really useful. Al Jazeera English, so not Al Jazeera America, Al Jazeera English. Most of the people who work for this outlet are Western trained, often from CNN or the BBC. But they do have this great section on which it's in depth. So it's investigative pieces from different places around the world. Today's just happened to be about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but they do a lot of work on stories from Africa that get overlooked. They've actually done a fair amount of stuff from Eastern Europe. It's a really great resource. I like the Christian Science Monitor a lot. It's the American newspaper I read most frequently. I read the New York Times a lot, but I like the Christian Science Monitor. They do a lot of really good international reporting. Spiegel Online is a German news magazine, and they have an English version for international audience, which is a really nice sort of European perspective, clearly with the German sort of tint. But I was trying to think of what or media outlets that maybe you weren't familiar with. It's great. I really like Spiegel a lot. That's Global Voices, right? So I can't see what, there's a story, an April Fool's story, clearly, about how they were reporting on a fake country. But then there's a lot of really interesting stuff coming out. And they are associated also with a program called Rising Voices, where they fund media out projects in some countries to sort of give people access and to be able to produce their own stories as well. And then this is Carnegie. So this is the Carnegie Endowment site. And so I pulled up Ukraine purposely. And then if you see towards the bottom, it says, Dmitry something, I can't remember his last name, is writing about this in another place. So especially for international issues and sort of policy and analysis breakdown, I think it's really useful. And then this is something, I don't know if you know about this, Ben or Diana. So I was trying to find what is a good example of a Russian media outlet I could share. This is Russia Direct. It's a blog, which is, as far as I can tell, and I tried to follow the links as much as I could, right? Funded by the state newspaper in Russia, I believe. It's all, it seemed that's what it was saying, but it's a little murky. I think it's interesting because it's a chance to access this perspective that you're not going to find in the American media. Even if you think it's biased and propagandistic, it's still access to that voice and to that perspective so you can be a little better informed about what's happening there. And I use this one because I like the picture, but they also have a section on Ukraine and Crimea and what's happening there. And then that's Google image search for just Russia. So I like the one in the bottom with the bear threatening everything. And so thank you. That's sort of my perspective.
So thank you, Deanna, Ben, and Rosemary. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to pose or something they'd like to discuss? If you say it, I'll repeat it into the microphone for cats. Or if you'd like to come up, you could come up and ask the question.
I think I do have a question. I remember, I sort of thought I saw a news story which discusses the run-up to the action in Crimea. I was unable to find the story. I didn't make a note at that time. Did President Putin hesitate a lot before ordering the intervention? Was that your impression? Was it something that was his hand forced once a coup took place in Kiev and President Yanukovych had to flee? Was his hand forced in some way? And there was the possibility of Ukraine being drawn into NATO. Oh.
Long term, yeah. Long term, becoming allied with the European Union was seen as a first step towards joining NATO. That's what was really angering them. But there was no immediate threat of that at all. No, he made up the immediate threat of supposedly Ukrainian thugs were beating up Russians and threatening them. But there's no evidence of that at all.
Do you need to repeat the question? Do you want to? I was just.
How can I put that question in a nutshell?
I'm sorry.
Was,
no,
that's
no,
okay. Was Putin's hand forced
In a way,
in a way?
by what is the word I used? When the I don't know what word you would use, when the coup took place at Kiev and President Yanukovych was forced out.
When Yanukovych was basically forced out or felt he had to leave, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that, and this is my perspective from that I got from both the Russian news and the American news. I think the intervention, and I don't know, I think intervention is still a very strong word for what happened there. And I think that still sending the army there and the measures that were taken by Putin, I think it was the last resort. The power was the last resort, and Putin was very, very careful about what he was doing. And of course, he was following the events that were happening in Ukraine, and he had to wait for Yanukovych to flee, and at first he was helping Yanukovych, and by the rumors Yanukovych fled to Russia. Putin was not recognizing the power or legitimacy of the Maidan rulers, and when he did decide to invade Crimea, it was basically because there were a lot of Russian people, and that's how it was portrayed in the Russian media. There were a lot of Russian citizens who were actually asking for help. And at first it was hard for me to believe that, especially living here in the United States and frequently hearing another side of the story. But on the other hand, during that crisis in Ukraine, people were facing financial problems. Ukraine was running out of money. And in that choice that they had, European Union or Russia, first of all, they weren't really close to becoming a part of the European Union, so Russia was their savior in terms of financial stability, I would say. But Putin was very, very careful. I don't think he was forced, but I think it was his last resort to go to Crimea. But he did it very carefully. Only one person died during that invasion for the whole period, and it was a mistake. It wasn't something done on purpose. If you remember the invasion of Kosovo, how many people died in just one night? So I don't think he was forced. I think it was something that he had to do to show also those pro-Maidan people that, Russia is a very powerful neighbor. And if you go any further, there is going to be circumstances. And they showed it on the example of Ukraine.
Other questions? Or things that you'd like to discuss with each other or talk with to each other?
I have some things
Sure.
to add on. I really liked when Ben mentioned that promise that the Press Secretary of State Baker gave to Gorbachev in 1989 for not expanding NATO. But then they didn't follow through. And I wanted to mention that event too, and I think that was the beginning of distrust. I think that was the beginning of distrust between two countries, or specifically Russia not trusting the West. And right now with Ukraine, they're basically showing that, we understand that you are, meaning the West, are very strong, but you cannot treat Russia like this. And then the second part for Rosemary, I really like the Bayer picture, and maybe we can go back to it. And I wanted to note that if we see, it says not Russia, but it says the USSR. So I assume that picture was made or done during the Soviet times, and you can see how even then the narrative was threat, and how this Cold War narrative is still lingering in the air, and how it has always been like that.
Actually, you can find under President Reagan, it was probably one of the most successful political ads of all time. It was about 2 minutes long. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it, just Google it anytime. And it has this fellow going into the woods, and there's this kind of throbbing, kind of ominous, kind of heartbeat, like someone's nervous, and the overlay goes, is there a bear in the woods? And then this narrator says, and again there's this threatening kind of sound, we don't know if there is a bear in the woods, but if there's a bear in the woods, you should carry your weapon, shouldn't you? And that was supposedly one of the most successful political ads of all time. I would like to add, though, to what you're saying, if it's okay, if you don't mind. I think when you're justifying Putin as a rational actor who's responding to outside, I think that goes to a certain extent. But just like American politicians, when they're framing their response to what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, they're looking at their constituency, and their response is governed to a large extent about how it can promote their own. And Putin is not doing very well. He wasn't doing very well in popular polls before this. And the economy is in deep trouble because it's a kleptocracy where, there's huge differences between the wealthy and the poor. And for example, with the Olympic, which cost $50 billion, it was accompanied by an announcement that pensions would be reduced and that there would not be any adjustments in cost of living for the next 5 years or so. And the previous finance minister, Kudrin, who was really very admired in the West, he'd built up an emergency fund of, I don't know what it was, $200 billion or so, and it's all been expended in the last 4 or 5 years. So the country is still exporting natural resources, and it's not exporting anything else. It's not modernizing in a significant way. And this is doing him a great service because, he can flex his muscle, he can take his shirt off, and, he can essentially distract attention from what's going on in his own country, don't you think?
I definitely agree, and I think when speaking about the Olympics, the big distraction was those undeveloped hotels, because before that, as we remember, there was a very controversial anti-LGBT law that was accepted in Russia. There was a scandal with Snowden. There were so many things going on that the West was talking about, and then all of a sudden, right before the Olympics, there were all of the conversation about anti-LGBT laws were shut down and replaced with those pictures from the hotels. And I think it was to Putin, it was on to hand that the media would talk about these issues instead of poor economy, anti-LGBT laws, everything that you mentioned right now. It was a distraction. It was a very clear distraction. Although for Russians, and I know for myself, it was quite embarrassing. And I just want to say that I'm not necessarily justifying Putin or protecting him, but I'm thinking about the current context and current conditions of life.
He's no Hitler. And that's
He definitely is no Hitler, and I think there is nobody else who can right now pick up Russia where it is and lead it. And I'm not sure if it's because of Putin's ruling there's nobody else, because we know how it works, and there were a lot of businessmen, and Putin helped them created good environments for business developments, but with one condition, that these people would not go into politics. So he kind of gave them money, bought them away. So this is a very controversial, but one of my professors called Putin a person with balls of steel. He's a very strong person with a strong agenda. And his third term is controversial, and the economy is going down right now. People love him because they still get the bread, they still get a little raise, their lives are developing. As a scientist, a social scientist, of course, I understand beyond what's going on in the country, and I'm not necessarily. And I don't necessarily love Putin, but I think
I was going to say that I think if you look back at all of the news coverage of Russia from, I mean, for the last year or so, but the LGBT law, the run up to Sochi, Snowden, and now Ukraine, I think if you go back and look, there's a lot of this wanting to sort of make this East-West divide in Ukraine, but also sort of in the world salient again, right? Because almost every time something happens, the news media says, oh, it's Russia asserting its power. In Ukraine, when the Euromaidan protests were just really getting to start, you heard a lot of this in the media, right? Oh, how is Putin going to react? What is he going to do? Like, there's this sort of primed reaction in media to say, this is an enemy that we've had for a long time, and it's sort of been a silent threat, but now he's going to come out and spring out with his shirt off and say, take over the world. But that's, I mean, if you think about the images of Putin that have been out there, of him, he staged that, but some of the other images that the media perpetuates and the narratives, it's all back to this idea that there's this East-West divide that's hard and fast, when I think Ben showed in Ukraine itself this East and West divide that was played up so much in the media, right, is really an easy narrative to hang something on when it's not really the reality. And I think it's something to think about in the media, is that what we get is this simplistic story that does not reflect the reality of the complications in the region and the reality of the complications with relations between the United States and Russia as well. It's very simplistic.
I wanted to ask you, what do you think about the CNN coverage of this event? Because for the past 3 weeks, whenever I went on the CNN website, all their stories were connected with the Flight 370. And there were a lot of big events going on in Ukraine, but they were not, you really had to search for them. Do you think it's American sort of framing, trying not to intensify the relationship?
I think that is more a factor of how the news cycle works. We're very driven by events. So when Euromaidan was happening and when Putin went into Crimea, and now that this is sort of ratcheting back up with NATO, we hang on to events, right? And so Putin went into Crimea, nothing else happened. We don't really have to cover it so heavily. And then the plane went down, and now that's all we talk about until his most recent Fort Hood shooting, right? We hang on to events very fiercely, especially in broadcast, and especially in 24-hour broadcast, when every half hour you need new news stories to fill blocks. So if I just reported on Ukraine yesterday, I'm not going to report on Ukraine today, unless there's a significant change. If it's just no one still knows what's going to happen, I'm not going to report on that story. So I think it's maybe a little short-sightedness on not understanding this context and sort of seeing the bigger picture of what's happening there, and also just the nature of the news cycle. We have to have stories on the air, and if there's nothing new happening, if it's not new, it's not news, basically.
May I? Go ahead, if you want to, you have a
Well,
question?
kind of piggybacking on what you were saying, Rosemary, why is it the case? Because I feel the same way that you do, that in a lot of news, the stories are presented very simplistically and non-contextually, and it seems like sometimes a high schooler could do the work. Why is that the case?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of institutional reasons why that's the case. The first among them is most of us aren't specialists, right? So a lot of people who are reporting on Russia and Ukraine or the plane being down aren't specialists, right? They're people who have been trained to be general assignment reporters, where you learn how to ask questions, but maybe you're not deep into the history of a place. So that's part of it. Part of it is that need to be able to draw in everybody, and so you tend to write to the lowest common denominator. Not every news outlet does that, but I think most of them, especially when you're a broadcasting outlet and you're fighting for advertising dollars, you don't want to alienate anybody. And then two, it's when you have a short amount of time, you go the most simple route. It's all, because if you have a minute and a half to tell a story, it's not going to be nuanced or contextualized. If we're watching Frontline, and that's an outlet that everyone should watch too, right? Be on Twitter and watch Frontline. If you have an hour and a half, 2 hours for Frontline, that's a chance to really nuance a story. If you even have 20 minutes on TV, which would be outrageous, you still aren't going to get sort of the full context of it. And then two, if reporters aren't specialists, editors also aren't going to be specialists largely. And so it's I think a lot of factors that go into it. Because journalists care, but they don't always have the space or the time to be as thoughtful about their reporting as they could be.
And just following up, do you feel like it's always been that way? Because I could be wrong, but I feel like this is a newer occurrence, that news is more shallow. And that doesn't go for all outlets, but like I'm thinking what I see, rolled on CNN over and over, and it's just very surface.
I think it's hard to say yes now. It's much worse than it ever was. It's always hard to make that judgment when you're in the moment. I think that there's certainly less space for thoughtful news than there was,
There's something
especially.
to do with regulation, isn't it?
What?
There's a major change in regulation took place with
Well,
the
yeah, I
broadcasting,
mean,
didn't
yeah,
it?
because at one point news media had to meet a public service mandate, and I think you still have to if you're on broadcast, but it's different. It's not, you have to give so much block of time. It's sort of, you have to be able to give air to all viewpoints, I think is what it is now. But yeah, and I mean, there are a lot of pressures when you are having a 24-hour news cycle. I think that was one of the most detrimental things to solid broadcast reporting, and broadcasting is what I specialize in, was this fact that you have to always be telling a story, and generally it's got to be new if people are going to watch it. That's why such terrible, I think if you watch local news and you see tonight at 9, why everyone's going to die, right? Or let me tell you about the threat that's in your silverware drawer, right? But that's part of it, is that you're constantly needing to feed that beast and to find something new to talk about. I don't know, I try not to say, yes, we're in the worst time ever for news, because I think it can be short-sighted, but it certainly feels like it's not a great time to be a news consumer, especially if you rely on broadcast. I think print's still pretty good if you find outlets that you like. I think broadcast has probably suffered a lot more in the current environment than some other outlets.
One piece of good news is that actually compared to 25 years ago, you can find out so much more about Russia very directly. And one thing that most people don't realize is that Russia now has pretty objective public opinion polls that are very sophisticated. And so we always say Russians like a strong ruler, something like that. But actually it's divided up by demographics. And what these opinion studies have shown is that, Russians tend to favor security right now if they have to make a choice. But they went through a depression that was 3 times the size of the depression in the United States. And I remember my parents thinking security was really important in their lives, But what these public opinion polls are readily accessible, and a lot of them, you can find them in translation, what they suggest is that Russian public opinion is a lot like European public opinion. It's not that far. It's not that different, in many, many ways. And when you talk about Russians, you have to really say who, like the millennials, or the people living in Petrozavodsk, or down south in the Black Sea. And it's much more humanizing to know that than to, think of all Russians as being big bears wandering around, kind of.
And I would say, I think a lot of people in Moscow, central Russia, are, especially Moscow, where they see the development and the rich and the gold. So I think the value of money is very important in Moscow. So I think a lot of Moscovitians are advanced and modern, and they are pro-development, pro-European Union. So there's not only a demographic division, but also regional.
Moscow's fantastic. It also has 80% of the country's wealth, so it's it's
In
amazing. It's
Putin's
amazing.
apartment.
My young students go there and they don't come back. I mean, they just stay there. They don't want to leave it.
It's a fantastic city, yeah.
And if you're really interested, Russia Today, although I think it's RT.com. So I don't know if you've heard of Voice of America. Russia Today is the Russian version of that. It's RT.com, and it's news from a Russian perspective. And so I looked at some of the news reporting on Sochi during the time, and the way RT was covering Sochi compared to NBC, which was the main carrier here in the United States. It was really interesting to see those differences. So if you're really interested in this issue and in sort of what's happening in Russia, again, it's a government-funded media outlet, but it's still access to that perspective that may give you a more diverse picture of Russia, right? Because Russians know generally that they are not just all one monolithic kind of people, whereas in the West we tend to see them as all kind of Muscovites, I think, as opposed to sort of looking at that map and sort of seeing the way the world looks from the Russian perspective. I was like, oh, that's a very different sort of way of seeing everything.
A lot of Russians today, and you may correct me on this, actually listen to Radio Svoboda, which is the Radio Liberty
Yeah.
created in the West as a Cold War, but it presents some really good news reporting in Russian, and particularly as Putin has clamped down on Russian independent news media. A lot of educated Russians go to this Western-derived but Russian language Radio Liberty right now, which is a kind of interesting development.
And there is a new radio station, Dozht, that translates as rain.
Rain, yeah.
Have you heard of
No.
this one? And it's a quite modern, quite new radio station. And Ksenia Sobchak is the daughter of a former governor of St. Petersburg, and he used to.
She was a model, she's quite a...
She
Impressive
was
woman.
an actress, an entrepreneur. She has business, but now she is in politics, and she's in the opposition, and she has sort of TV programs or radio programs that you can actually stream online, and that new radio station attracts a lot of oppositioners.
Her father was an oppositionist in the Soviet Union. He was one of the leading liberalizers of the country under Gorbachev. But then he became the mayor of St. Petersburg, right? And he brought Putin back from Germany to be his closest advisor. So,
Yes.
But now she's this very attractive figure who's an oppositionist. She could be the next president, right?
She could be the next president. Maybe in 20, 30 years, Russians are still very conservative. If Arnold Schwarzenegger can become a governor of California here, I'm not really sure how many years it will take for Russians to be less conservative to allow a woman and with this kind of past. But in her interview, she was talking about dinners as a child that she had with her father, the governor, and Putin. And she knows Putin very well from a human perspective. And she's been in a lawsuit last year because of money laundering. So Putin, it's an interesting interaction. And it will be interesting to see how far she will, because after that lawsuit, she sort of stepped back from the activist, and she was still claiming to be working with the opposition, but she wasn't participating in their events directly.
What do you think of Pussy Riot?
I, as a Russian person, and I know that the Pussy Riot case received a lot of Western coverage, and it was bashed, and when they were sent to prison, a lot of Western countries were not very satisfied and happy about it. But from a Russian perspective, I can say that their acts in the cathedral have offended a lot of Russians, because Russians are religious, and this is sacred. This religion is something sacred. There, you cannot really speak loudly in the church. You have to whisper. Women have to cover their heads. And what they did to me was crazy. And I understand they wanted to exercise some of their freedoms, but in this cultural context, I just don't think it was appropriate.
So if it's crazy, you go to jail for 3 years?
I agree that the punishment was too hard, because rapists get 2 years, 1 year.
Right.
So that's sort of the punishment. And Putin himself said in one of the press conferences that the punishment was too harsh, and they could be. But
As if he didn't make it himself.
he probably, I think he did.
Maybe I made a mistake. I put this pregnant woman in jail for 3 years.
And now he just released them along with Khodorkovsky.
Yeah. No, I understand, though, very much how, I think you're right, a lot of Russians were offended that they would pull this act in a church, et cetera, et cetera. Sure. It was seen as blasphemy of some sort. They're not very good musicians either.
They're not musicians at all.
I still have a question about the eastward expansion of NATO in violation of the understanding with President.
Believer, I get a parking ticket. I went to 840. Okay, thanks.
Was it, it was not, was it, I suppose, it remains understanding. It was a verbal agreement. Was that in
With
fact
the NATO, you said?
the eastward expansion of NATO? The promise that was made to Gorbachev, was it a verbal promise? Was it? Was there? Was it not? Would he not? Did he not ask for a written? It was not a formal treaty.
No.
It was not formalized.
That's a good question. Do you need to repeat that question? Or no, for the,
It's not very.
Can you say it again?
no,
In-
Linda said I thought you needed to repeat it for the.
I do, but now I need to formulate
Was,
it.
was the promise that was made to Gorbachev only verbal? Why didn't he ask him to put it down in writing, essentially? Good question, actually, but.
Why didn't he ask for the agreement put down in writing? Yeah.
I mean, it seems to have been a festering sore all these years. And it doesn't seem to have been any recourse under international law. To
Well, the reality is that, you know, that not only these former Soviet satellite states, they joined the EU and then had NATO, but also some former Soviet republics like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And then also, he had drawn the line saying, Putin had drawn the line several years ago saying, there are two places you're not going to come in. One is Georgia in the Caucasus, and the other is Ukraine. And the U.S. pursued a fairly aggressive policy there in Georgia as well. We sent in. So no, I mean I agree. You would think that at that time they might have asked for something more formal. Nevertheless, it was understood as a kind of commitment that they were not going to take advantage of Russia's weakness and withdrawal of the Warsaw Pact forces. But please.
And also, it's important to remember when it was done. The promise was given in 1989, and it was a period.
1990, actually.
Huh, my sources are wrong. But it was a period when the Cold War was sort of declining and the relationship was warming up. And when your relationship between two countries warm up, there were mutual sacrifices and cooperation. So that's why I think Gorbachev trusted the press secretary and Baker. That was Baker, right? He trusted Baker, but that wasn't. It was betrayed, and I think Gorbachev was very disappointed, and that's how we stopped trusting the words like that.
We are out of time, but please help me thank our speakers again. Thank you for your thoughtful questions and for being here with us tonight. Hopefully, we're walking away with a little bit more information and maybe a better idea of how we think about this topic in our own heads. Have a good evening.
Thank you.